Hey Unwrappers, if you enjoy this podcast's approach to the news, then you will love The Week magazine. Curated from a diverse range of independent sources, The Week magazine delivers a refreshingly open-minded view of current affairs. And now, for a limited time, you can enjoy 6 free issues and then save an extra 10% on a print and digital subscription. Simply enter the offer code SUMMER23 at theweek.co.uk/offer to claim your free trial today. That's the code SUMMER23 at theweek.co.uk/offer.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 17th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Commons Privilege Committee finding Boris Johnson did deliberately mislead Parliament over Partygate, Donald Trump pleading not guilty to unlawfully keeping classified documents, and the death of former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi at the age of 86. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Jamie Timson and Julia O'Driscoll, plus from the One Decision podcast, Julia Macfarlane. That's right, I knew this day would come. We have 2 Julias on the show. So, I don't know, to save confusion, do either of you have a compelling nickname that we can call you?
I mean, I often get called just by my nickname a lot of the time. I think that's a hangover from school.
Go on.
Macfarlane. It's a bit boring. But
Macfarlane's not your nickname, that's your surname.
Yeah, it's, my nickname I suppose is Jules, but
Okay.
I don't know, when people are sort of shouting at me in the office, that I'm often just called Macfarlane. I don't know why.
Other Julia is going to say that her nickname is also Jules.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, she's not. How about that? How about I'll go with Jules for you, Julia Macfarlane. Are you comfortable with that, or is it like a flashback to unpleasant school days?
No. If you were to call me Macfarlane, that would be, but Jules is fine.
Detention, Macfarlane.
Yeah.
That'd be like University Challenge.
Oh, man.
Okay. Well, Julia Macfarlane, Jules, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A Russian spy squatting in a British house.
The British capital is teeming with spies, or as the neoconservative think tank the Henry Jackson Society calls them, Russians. The explosive Putin Sees and Hears It All report estimates that there could be as many as 75,000 so-called informants routinely helping Moscow's secret services. Spy, 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 spy.
Is London full of Russian spies? A satirical video from ICYMI, a channel backed by RT, in 2018. Jules, that was then. What's happened this week?
So this is an interesting story that I think, given how much news has been going on this week, really flew under the radar. And that is the paper have revealed this investigation they've done into this Ukrainian businessman who they say is an alleged Russian informant, intelligence agent asset. And he's a businessman, and he and his family have been living a lavish lifestyle in London in a multi-million-pound apartment under the British government's Homes for Ukraine scheme. He came to London after fleeing the country at the start of the war, and then his family flew out to join him. Interestingly, he is sanctioned in Ukraine He's accused of fraud, and he's disputed these charges. But what's interesting is the Eye have taken his name to one of their contacts in the FBI, who say that he is someone they have suspected has been an FSB agent for many, many years. And their FBI source was really quite angry at the fact that he was living out in the open, free in London.
Julia O'Driscoll, this is hardly the first kind of London grad scandal that we've seen. We know they live among us, a lot of wealthy Russians. Is this damaging for the government because he came over in the Homes for Ukraine scheme? Or, does it just tell us what we already suspect?
No, I think it is particularly damaging because of the association with the scheme, and also the Eye's reporting includes information from several sources within the civil service and the Home Office who said that at the time that the scheme was created, there was a lot of infighting about security concerns. So Priti Patel, who was then Home Secretary, said that it would be naive and misguided to think that the scheme couldn't be subject to exploitation, whereas Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, was urging reportedly for security checks to be sped up. There was a lot of publicity at the time that refugees were getting stuck in other countries because the security checks were just taking so long, and these lengthy delays were putting a lot of pressure on these departments to come up with a solution.
Yeah, and there was a lot of criticism of Priti Patel at that time, Jamie. And then you were working, weren't you, with Grant Shapps, who himself took in some Ukrainian refugees, I think.
Yeah, could have been spies. We don't know.
Well, Priti Patel was subject to a lot of criticism herself for saying that the scheme would be exploited and therefore they had to do thorough checking. Obviously, spies came in anyway, but it does kind of prove her right, doesn't it?
Yeah, and, it's a sad day when I have to say that Priti Patel was correct about something, indeed, but all that about stopped clocks. I don't think it comes as much of a surprise. I mean, certainly not to me, who worked in government during this period of time when basically everything was being reactionary on the completely without real thorough thinking through. A lot of these schemes were coming up and we were just having to enact them. So it doesn't come as a massive surprise that there wasn't the checks and balances that potentially needed to happen. I think I would be careful to completely blame the scheme itself, because then you run down a risk of saying actually it wasn't that great. And I know that for a lot of families that did take in Ukrainians, it's been a real boon, and it was like a massive humanitarian aid. I think it's one of the few good humanitarian acts that this government have actually enacted. So I don't think we should be negative about it.
Well, this is it, isn't it, Jules? Was it just a sort of managed risk, really? Almost an inevitability that something like this could happen, but still necessary to allow as many people here as possible under the scheme as quickly as possible for humanitarian reasons?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really interesting at the time because clearly the government was responding to what was an outpouring of solidarity and sympathy among the British public for Ukrainians at the beginning of the re-invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022. Obviously, they wanted to bring forward a policy that was going to do something to help and show solidarity beyond the military support that the government was giving Ukraine at the time. But obviously, immigration, migrants, refugees, that's quite a difficult sort of policy area for the government. And I think the idea that British people with a spare bedroom could be encouraged to give shelter to Ukrainians for 6 months was a pretty good idea for the government, in the sense that this wasn't something that it's a lot cheaper getting ordinary Britons to essentially foot the bill for these Ukrainians. I mean, they did receive some compensation for the government for signing up to this scheme, but they would have saved a huge amount rather than putting them up in hotels, which is what they're doing currently to asylum seekers. And perhaps that was part of the idea, that they wanted to sort of separate in a large way how Ukrainian refugees fleeing the war were being treated compared to other asylum seekers from other parts of the world also fleeing war. So I think it was tricky, but there were lots of really positive humanitarian stories coming out of this, but also there have been quite a few negative experiences of people who I think perhaps signed up to this scheme out of really good intentions, but perhaps underestimating the undertaking of sheltering people from a very different country with very different cultural backgrounds and, in many cases, limited language skills.
But it's nonetheless such a presumably rare thing, Julia O'Driscoll, that an actual spy is being harboured by anyone in these circumstances. It's something that's going to play into future crises, though, isn't it? People will name this as an example, even if it has indeed gone under the radar in the news cycle this week. And we've seen similar situations in the past being talked about regarding ISIS operatives arriving as refugees from Syria, etc., haven't we?
Yeah, that is a very good point. I think it is worth stressing that the man who is of interest to the FBI came into the UK on a visa, so not through the scheme itself. It was his family who did. So I think that raises broader questions about the kind of visa and many other bigger issues here. But as you were saying about ISIS, yeah, this isn't the first time it's happened. In 2016, following the Paris attacks, the previous November, where 130 people were killed in the French capital, German intelligence agencies warned that ISIS militants were entering Europe disguised as refugees. And apparently there had been more than 100 reported tip-offs of ISIS fighters staying as refugees in Germany. And then there was another element to this as well, that obviously refugees are incredibly vulnerable, and Europol was warning that ISIS recruiters were also targeting these refugees to radicalize them. And obviously it's incredibly difficult to know the true scale of what that risk might be, but there is a risk.
Yeah, I mean, Jules, just finally on this, the individual at the centre of this hasn't been named by the iPaper. But what do you think is going to happen next to him? I mean, obviously the authorities now do know who he is. Is he going to be able to stay in London?
Well, what the latest that's happened is that Ian Duncan Smith, who's obviously a senior Tory grandee, he stood up in the House of Commons following this story, and he said that it would be very difficult to justify the UK government doing nothing in the face of what is quite strong evidence that this is a man not to be trusted. He asked what the government was doing, and asked the government to confirm whether or not there was an investigation into this man. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, was also asked about this in the Commons on Tuesday, and he basically said he would ensure that a department, whether it was his or the Home Office, would look into it. But I think this is another sort of difficult area for the government, particularly given that there have been many stories accusing the Conservatives of having ties to Moscow. We shouldn't forget the fact that when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, his office, number 10, delayed the publication of a report investigating Russian influence until after the 2019 election.
Okay. Julia, the other Julia O'Driscoll, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
Okay, Julia, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The climate kids are getting their day in court.
Do you feel like you're being used?
No. For me, I'm the one that's gotten involved in this, and I never really learned about climate change growing up or anything, and my dad never pushed this on me or anything like that. My generation and kids now, we can't wait for the next one to come along and fix this.
Montana resident Ricky Held speaking to Vice News back in April. Julia, what's the story?
So this week, the first ever constitutional climate trial in US history got underway in Montana. The case is Held versus State of Montana, and the plaintiffs are 16 young people who are aged between 5 years old and 22 years old. And they are alleging that Montana's energy policies have violated their constitutional rights to a clean and healthy environment. and they're suing specifically over the state's support of the fossil fuel industry. Montana has the largest coal reserves in the US and is a major coal exporter.
Okay. How did a situation arise where a group of teenagers are able to sue the state?
So it comes down essentially to a particular quirk in Montana's state constitution, in that since 1972, it has been written into it that everyone shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment for present and future generations. So it's been decided that there are grounds to challenge whether this has been upheld. The kids who have testified this week, or the young people, I should say, have shared their own experiences talking about harms to their health, harms to their livelihoods as well as a result of extreme weather.
Yeah, but decided by who? There aren't many 15-year-olds with the gumption to put together a lawsuit. So how has this come together?
So there's a non-profit law firm called Our Children's Trust who are backing them, and they're also supporting several other cases in 4 other states, including Hawaii, and that could also go to trial later this year. But this is the first one that has made it this far.
So, Jamie, there's some cynicism, isn't there, clearly, that I'm hinting at here, where you could say, and indeed opponents to this have, that this isn't a real grassroots suit, children coming out and saying our future is being threatened by you, the state of Montana. This is a scheme being perpetrated by a special interest group that aren't even based in Montana. But at the same time, if they've identified this quirk of law, maybe they do have a case, and indeed it is coming before a judge.
What's interesting about it, about the specific case as well, is the way that it's drawn up. A lot of the plaintiffs, these 16-year-olds, are talking about the individual effects that climate change have had on them as people, rather than talking about the knock-on effects of climate change into the wider. And it has been drawn up, obviously, in a very specialised way in order to get a judge to hear the case. And the stuff that I was reading around it, a lot of people were very surprised that the judge was taking this on. Even at all, to listen to it. But now that they have, as far as I understand, it's actually a kind of an initial point, just looking at whether or not the law is out of step with the Constitution. It's not like the judge will ever come through and say, like, you absolutely have to change the Constitution to do X, Y, and Z. It will just say this is out of step, so you have to do something about it. And obviously, there's a massive global issue here, and it's not just down to Montana, but it is, I think, really interesting. And the reason that, I think it's worth discussing is just how whether or not young people, if using non-profit organizations or anything else, can gather together to make a real change. I actually don't really think it matters whether or not it's an out-of-state grassroots organization that's stirring up this kind of feeling, because when you listen to the people involved, you listen to the teenagers and everything, they really do care.
Well, this is it, isn't it, Jules? And we often hear, Greta Thunberg's the obvious example, but I'm sure there are tens of thousands of examples all over the world. We often hear the younger generation, for want of a better phrase, kind of being the solution to the climate crisis and being celebrated for it. But it sort of shows a deficit in what the grown-ups have been doing, doesn't it?
I think that's really true, and I think there are a lot of cases. I think it's becoming more and more well known that a lot of people, a lot of Gen Z teens and young people are getting what's being described as climate anxiety. And I mean, my brother, who was born in 95, which he says makes him a millennial, he's not, he's Gen Z. There were a few years when he was really anxious about the climate crisis, and it caused him quite a lot of stress. And he studied sustainability in university, I think, because of these anxieties. And actually, recently he's changed his tune, and he's now of the mind that actually the Earth is doomed and we're just going to have to colonize Mars. Cynicism, which probably does identify him as a millennial after all, perhaps. But I think it is difficult because, these are the people who are going to live with the consequences of today. And I think this trial is interesting because I think there are legal and judicial issues here. The attorneys for the state have said that, climate change is a global policy issue, and it's not one that courts can address. And judges, not just this judge, but judges hearing some of these other trials that are going on in Oregon and Hawaii have also said that the court is in a tricky position here because they can't really be making policy decisions which should be left to the federal government. But I think the issuing of a judgment would have a powerful sort of symbolic effect. And I think in the US, certainly getting money, getting companies to pay fees or getting defendants to pay fines to plaintiffs is kind of a way of how they seek compensate. The payment of money is how a lot of justice is sort of served in the US.
The campaigners have actually already had a victory in a way, Julia, haven't they? Because in addition to the bit of Montana law you quoted earlier, the state constitution saying that people are entitled to a clean and healthful environment, there was this energy vision that was established as part of their law as well, which basically said, and we'll mine loads of coal because that's great for the economy. And that's been reversed, hasn't it? As a result of trying to fend off this lawsuit. Didn't work, obviously, but I suppose that's good news for campaigners too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was an attempt by the state to get the whole thing thrown out. But the judge ruled that there was still grounds to review the energy policies and the environmental acts as well. And it kind of comes into this bigger question about the Montana economy as well, and whether shifting to a greener energy economy is viable and how much support that would have. So there's this interesting duality where the state is the biggest US exporter of coal, but also it massively relies on outdoor recreation as a huge source of income, like billions of dollars a year. It's known for fishing, agriculture, skiing, and obviously climate change is affecting all of those activities. And so while this is going on, people's livelihoods are at risk, and there has been this focus that actually by shifting from fossil fuels to green energy and the jobs that would come with it, those jobs might not pay as much, but there are so many other jobs that may not exist if that entire sector of tourism just disappears as a result of climate change.
And I think if you're looking at it in terms of court cases, the knock-on effect. One of the plaintiffs said you don't hear about all the civil rights cases that failed before Brown versus Education. And so it's effectively saying that this could be one of the landmark decisions that starts to kind of trickle down. And I was just looking, because I was thinking kind of broadening it out a bit, I was looking at the UK and kind of climate court cases that are happening in the UK. And actually, this is one that I hadn't really seen before. But next week in the Supreme Court, they're hearing about the a drilling case in Horse Hill in Surrey, where a group of kind of residents and environmental campaigners are fighting a decision by the council to grant UK oil and gas permission for drilling. And West Cumbria Mining Limited, who are behind the first ever, the first kind of in decades prospective coal mine for the UK, have been given permission to intervene in the case. So this is a company, West Cumbria Mining, that are working some 370 miles away from Horse Hill. And so next week in the Supreme Court, they'll listen, because basically the argument from the residents is that the oil that's extracted should that then causes environmental issues, that kind of impact should be taken into account when you're granting planning permission for things, and that's not currently happening. So it is. I do tend to think that we're getting into the stage now where climate change trials and court cases are becoming much more common, and potentially that is a way to deal with the crisis.
Yeah, although, Jules, in this country, we are less litigious than in the US. We're less used to kind of group lawsuits and things. I mean, yes, you do see trials, don't you, where someone's been breathing in car fumes and then got very ill and things like that. But I mean, in general, for young people protesting climate change, if you don't want to join Just Stop Oil and disrupt everything, what is there for you to do?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And you saying that we're a lot less litigious than the US, I always remember that famous story of that woman who sued McDonald's in the US for millions of dollars because she burnt her tongue on her coffee or something. We certainly don't have that culture in the UK. I think there's such an interesting parallel here because I'm talking to you guys from Oxfordshire, where there are plans to build a huge solar panel field on brown belt land, and there are lots of groups who are protesting protesting the building of that. And guess what? These groups are made up of a majority of older people. So you have, in a sense, you have young people in the US trying to legislate against the fossil fuel industry. And then here you have older residents trying to stop solar panels being built in rural areas in the UK. I think Just Stop Oil is obviously hugely divisive, and there have been a lot of negative headlines about them recently. It'll be interesting to see if these court cases in the US provide some inspiration, and perhaps we'll start to see some of things happening in this country.
Julia, what do you think are their chances?
I think there's a good chance that they might win. And I think it's already, as we discussed, significant in itself. I think the only thing I would add is that when this case was first entered in 2020, the oldest plaintiff was 19, and now they're 22. And Greta Thunberg has just graduated and is now hopefully looking for a job and might save us all. I think, we talk about the youth kids and the climate kids and the school strikes, but those kids are growing up, and I'm really excited to see what happens in the next 5 years, because the momentum isn't slowing down.
Meanwhile, the average age of a senator remains 78 or whatever. Okay, watch this space. Jamie, you're up next after this. Okay, Jamie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we learnt it's actually Eat, Pray, Panda.
But over the course of this weekend, I have received an enormous, massive outpouring of reactions and responses from my Ukrainian readers, expressing anger, sorrow, disappointment, and pain about the fact that I would choose to release a book into the world right now, any book, no matter what the subject of it is, that is set in Russia.
Author Elizabeth Gilbert taking to Twitter for an announcement on Monday, which has since been seen over 7 million times. Jamie, what's the story?
Yeah, so she is an author, perhaps kind of most well-known for Eat, Pray, Love, which kind of initially wasn't meant to be a self-help book, but did turn into a bit of a self-help book and had a lovely film with Julia Roberts that I can heartily recommend everyone go and watch after they've listened to this podcast. But this week, she announced that she was postponing the release date of her novel, called The Snow Forest. The book was about the extraordinary story of Karp Lykov and his family, who were discovered by geologists in 1978 after surviving for decades, completely cut off from all human contact in the Siberian taiga. That's taiga spelled Taiga, not in a Siberian taiga, just in case anyone was confused. So she, as she says, as we heard from the clip, she was there was a lot of anger about it from Ukrainian readers. That kind of manifested itself in a series of good reads. I don't know if anyone's been on Goodreads. Have you been on a Goodreads, Ollie?
Yeah, so that's a sort of Amazon-owned reviews website, isn't it? Where users can say what they think of books. 500
one-star reviews for this book that hasn't even come out yet from Ukrainian, a variety of Ukrainian and Ukrainian supporters, I would imagine.
Okay, so she's getting trolled, basically, for having deigned to write a fictional novel, but inspired by truth, set in Russia, but even,
not this Russia, not now.
Exactly. Yes. Who were anti-Soviet.
What I would just say before we get into it, because it is actually a really fascinating discussion, not to blow my own trumpet, great one to bring to the podcast. But what I would just say before we get into it is that it was intended to be published in February 2024, which, I mean, fingers crossed it's not, but is looking likely to be the second, would be the same month as the second anniversary of of the invasion, and also has links back to the Crimean war in 2015, because it was a similar sort of time. So there may be, I've oscillated between both sides on this one, and that it was that point that maybe actually highlighted to me that actually maybe there's a bit of kind of truth in that idea that this was maybe a bit misguided. Having some sensitivities, yes. Exactly.
Okay, but Julia, having some sensitivity for the exact release date of a book, I do understand that. But to say my work of historical fiction is being postponed indefinitely because of a relatively irrelevant war that's happening now, is that unprecedented?
I think it probably is. I think it's a bad decision. Pen America put it very well. Jamie's just done a great gasp, saying that it was a decision that was well intended but wrong-headed, which I think I would agree with. And the chief executive, Suzanne Nossel, said that setting a book in Russia doesn't exacerbate oppression. And also that I think this decision is taking away a reader's authority. Like, essentially, Gilbert has decided that the safest thing to do, I assume for her own reputation, is to pause the book or pull it. But I think that readers have a lot of authority over what they read, and I think to just take it away is almost a little bit dangerous. Like, let the judgment be made. If you don't stand by what you wrote, maybe it's just not a very good book.
Well, Jules, I suppose to an extent it comes down to whether you take her at her word in that Twitter video where she seems genuinely kind of emotionally affected and reflective, and this is a decision that I'm making and I realise I made a mistake, or whether you think she's just running frit from trolls. I mean, just to give you some idea of the kind of reviews people were writing on Goodreads, as Jamie says, people who clearly couldn't have read it yet. Apologies for the language. Here are some sample comments. While Ukrainians are dying from Russian terrorists, famous authors are writing books about them and romanticizing these bastards. Another one wrote, "It's time to forget about all imperialistic shit that Russia doing over the centuries. Maybe, Elizabeth, you should have spent your pandemic time reading about all the Russian terror." I mean, did she just think, God, you know what? I don't want to have to deal with this. I'm just an author.
I mean, it's hard to tell. I think one thing that is interesting about this is that this whole sort of her move has reignited a lot of the criticism that is associated with her and her whole persona. There is a big swathe of people who can't stand Elizabeth Gilbert, who find her whole persona, people say is affected, endearing to the readers. She addresses her readers as dear ones. She's very hippie-ish and sort of butter wouldn't melt persona. But that could just be the way she is. And, you know, as an Indonesian, I have a very complicated relationship with Elizabeth Gilbert because she has pretty much single-handedly destroyed the island of Bali with that book. And so it's complicated.
What do you mean? Because it's had an influx of tourism?
Bali has been completely overrun with tourists, and you know, in some ways it's very good. It's really helped the local economy, but Bali is now sort of a pastiche of what it used to be, you know, in the 90s. When I was growing up in Indonesia, it was the tourism there was far more sustainable, and now it's just become a parody. Interestingly, Bali is actually facing a huge influx of Russians and Ukrainians who are trying to escape the war, and the local Indonesian population are getting really fed up of them. But that's beside the point.
This is very interesting. We are drifting off topic. Do you think she should have written a novel set in Russia or not?
I think that there are questions about art is supposed to spark opinion and debate, and everyone is free to disagree with things. But I think this kind of the online hounding of authors, of artists, and this whole like review bombing, this practice of spamming 1-star reviews for a book you haven't read, or indeed for a movie or a TV adaptation you haven't seen yet, such as the Lord of the Rings Amazon Prime TV show, which was also review bombed before it was even aired because a lot of people didn't like the fact that there were black and brown people in the cast, and they said that was drifting away from canon. This idea of online mobs trying to sort of censor what they think should be allowed in our arts and cultural scene, I think is dangerous. I agree with Julia and Jamie 100%.
And Jamie, you know, something that seems out of proportion for the kind of author that Gilbert is, as Jules was suggesting there. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of, I know they're different issues, but it reminds me a little bit of Graham Norton answering a question at a book festival about J.K. Rowling and the trans debate. And for what was a fairly sort of thought through and level-headed answer, getting essentially hounded off Twitter and clearly just thinking, you know what? I mean, it's fairly obvious what Graham Norton stands for in terms of inclusivity. Clearly just thinking, you know, I don't need this. I'm not this person. I don't want to be part of this debate. Isn't it that? Isn't it just like she just doesn't want to be part of this debate, and cancel culture has just chased her away from publishing what appears to be a pretty innocent tome?
Yeah. I think, I mean, not to get like a Nora Ephron film, but Julia and Julia are kind of both right in a way.
I can't believe we missed that opportunity earlier.
I think there is an element of, what good does it serve to kind of hound this person away from publishing it? And there probably is an element of dangerousness to basically saying, like, we can't have arts set in Russia released at this time anymore. And I think there is a danger with that kind of stuff. I do think also, though, that she's incredibly po-faced. She's incredibly earnest in that video. And in a way, it's kind of her personal choice. I'm not kind of shying away from the fact that we should have like a very lively debate about this. But if she doesn't want to release a book because, like you say, she can't be bothered, or she doesn't really think, whatever. I mean, you do have to think about the publishers, because she's obviously said that she said in the video that everyone who's already pre-ordered could get a refund. And so the publishers must just be like, oh, great. So this is a good, a good thing. So, but I think, yes, I think if it wasn't Elizabeth Gilbert, potentially there would be more of an issue around, the dangers of good novels going to waste. But I think we can pretty much all agree. I don't think I was going to be reading this book.
Well, you are the ultimate arbiter of good taste, obviously.
Yeah,
but I mean, Julia, what about the really classic stuff then? If you're the National Theatre or, an English ballet company or whatever, does this mean you don't do Tchaikovsky and Chekhov now? I mean, like, where do we draw the line? There's some great, influential, important Russian art.
Yeah.
Is that banned?
Exactly. I think that's why it potentially does set a slightly dangerous precedent. It's definitely a slippery slope of, what does that mean? And I can understand. I remember when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and there were concerts scheduled where, people decided actually it wasn't appropriate and they would change the program and that kind of thing. But actually, as the war has continued, there is a real need for depth and nuance and conversation around it, and just a kind of blanket black and white, we don't play this, or we don't look at works by this artist, it just doesn't work. And I think it can be, I just think it can be dealt with in such a better way. And I was thinking about what Elizabeth Gilbert could have done, and I would love to hear what her publishers would say. But I think, she could have written a prologue, or decided to undertake another literary project that would, rectify some of the hurt that she'd done, people claim she'd done. I don't know. I just feel like it was almost an easy out.
I mean, there's also an identity politics vein to this, though, isn't there, Jamie? In that, we're in a culture now where people find it easier to write a novel set in Africa if they have ethnic African origins. They find it more defensible to write a character with a gay protagonist if they themselves are gay. They know if those aren't the cases that they're going to have to defend those things, rather than just saying, like they would in the old days, well, I use my imagination because I'm a writer. Do you think this would be different if she was Russian or Ukrainian?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of the, when you look at Eat, Pray, Love as a book, I saw an interesting one defending her that was talking about how refreshing it is to read Eat, Pray, Love now and not have people heavily caveat all of the things that they're saying, even though one critic did describe it as being called wealthy, whiny and white. There is an element of now, yes, potentially, if you are that person, if you are Elizabeth Gilbert, you probably can't write about you can't write a book like Eat, Pray, Love again. But I would also say that maybe potentially that's a good thing, and that really, we should be leaving some elements of culture to the people that know them best and come from the place, because, with the...
But can't readers decide that when they buy the book?
Yeah. No, I think they absolutely can.
I mean, if I want to read a book set in France by Stephen King, why can't I? I can choose a French author if I want.
Yeah, but I guess it's to do with how easy it is for you to get hold of a French author, or how well, the difference between Elizabeth Gilbert and how much backing she has. Someone described it as like a new Marvel film versus a kind of up and coming, like a up and coming French author is massive. So we maybe do need to give a leg up to some what's the word I'm looking for? We maybe do need to give a leg up to some undiscovered authors.
Well, in that spirit, I wanted to end this week by asking you for some book recommendations, because the summer holidays are upon us. A week unwrapped book club, if you will. I want genuine recommendations, please. It doesn't matter how silly they are, but you need to actually be able to defend them as a recommendation. Jules, what do you read for pleasure?
I have not read a book for pleasure in a really long time. I read all books for pleasure, but I've been reading a lot of, a lot of geopolitics. You'll groan at me when I say a lot of geopolitics.
Okay.
Apart from,
give us a geopolitical book that we can read on the beach. Then
the only one that isn't was Spare. I did read Spare, and I did actually read that on holiday, and that was interesting. But one book I would really recommend everyone read that's just come out recently is called Cobalt Red, and it's about the situation in the Congo where human beings are really suffering in the cobalt mining industry for our phones and laptops and electric cars. It was a really powerful read.
Okay, yeah, good recommendation. Jamie?
I don't know if you guys have heard of this book called Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert.
I
know. The book that I always recommend to everyone is called Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid, and it is genuinely one of the best books I've read in the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay, is it a novel?
Yeah, it's a novel. It's about basically what's going on in America, and then more widely young people culture, set about a black girl initially who becomes a babysitter for a wealthy white family and goes from there.
And Julia?
Mine is a book called Open Water by Caleb Azuma Nelson, and it's a short story. It's basically a love letter to Southeast London, and it also comes with a really good Spotify playlist that you should listen to while you read it.
Oh,
so it's perfect for the beach.
Oh, nice. Yes, multimedia. Mine, thanks for asking, is Mr. Wilder and Me by Jonathan Coe, but I'm only halfway through it at the moment, so who knows? The second half might be awful. I'm enjoying it. My thanks to the two Julias, O'Driscoll and Macfarlane, and Jamie Timson. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. That includes Spotify if you're listening to a trendy book playlist at the same time. Just tap follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.